So this video, which was supposed to be a retrospective on Squad Conquest, was supposed to actually be made about 3 weeks ago, and no more than 2 weeks before my still impending big video project. And now we're already on to the next mode, which is Rush, being featured for Tides of War, and I'll be doing a video on that relatively soon. Even as late as even as late as it is, I still wanted to get my 2 cents in on Squad Conquest. Well, as far as the reception goes, it's hard to say whether the players were simply starved for something different, which would also kind of largely validate DICE's drip feed of small experimental modes that are kind of still work in progress, being released through limited time windows. Which I'm not a huge fan of, or if the mode actually did resonate in some way with the player base. But as far as I could tell, Squad Conquest was a fairly popular mode, and there are no actual public records of how many people proactively played Squad Conquest because not all of the stats are fully tracked. But from what I could tell, there were plenty of active servers during the evening hours for North American region, which, by the way, is a smaller region than the Europeans region. I think it's by about half, maybe 2/3 of concurrent players at any given time usually. So there were, I want to say, during the evening hours for North American servers, while the Tides of War assignments were funneling the people into the mode, there were anywhere between 20, maybe even 40 servers that were always active for the mode during the peak hours. And no less than half of that could be seen even after the Tides of War assignment stopped funneling people into the mode, well into its extended run, I want to say. And it's a mode that a lot of people certainly played, and I think a lot of people, as skilled players as well as newcomers alike, quite enjoyed it. And I think it kind of seemed to validate a lot of people's contention that not all Battlefield experiences are synonymous with the so-called 64-player mode chaos. And I'm kind of certainly surprised myself that Squad Conquest was that well received, because it certainly wasn't without its fair share of issues. I think the biggest one, was the team balances were so just woefully one-sided in nearly every single match that I played on. And on the very few occasions when the teams were balanced, which was very rare, and on even fewer occasions where I managed to participate in prearranged matches where, full teams try to play each other, the experience definitely was far improved. But this was too far in between, I think. It's most certainly on public servers. And I guess, Battlefield 5, DICE kind of seems to have this goal of letting squads stick together as much as possible. And, when you only have potentially 2 squads in a team, because there are only 8 people in a team, 4 players to a squad, I can understand how difficult this would be. But if the players were more proactively fed into the match from the get-go based on some kind of skill-based algorithm, even if players had to wait, if they were able to be matched more to their skill levels, I think it would have been a much better experience. And I think, given how much interest it seemed to get, I think it would have been a good time to kind of carry over whatever algorithm they had for incursions and kind of bring it in. I think it would have been a fantastic time to try out a more skill-based matchmaking system for the 8 versus 8. Obviously, it's much more difficult for 16 versus 16 or 32 versus 32, but it really felt like a missed opportunity. And of course, it was missing RSP as well, which a lot of people kind of expected to see when this mode came out, but I'll be getting to that a little bit later. Now, the maps themselves also kind of left a lot to be desired as well. I think the maps were much smaller, about half the size of Domination, which was designed for 32 players, which I think in this game, at least, they seem a little bit too large. And even though they were a little bit more than half the size of Domination maps, on 8v8 it did feel a little bit better, I think, than the Domination maps do on 32 players, which kind of seems a little sparse at times. Arras, for instance, didn't really take advantage of what I thought was one of the best, urban, quote-unquote urban area combat, close quarter combat. Instead, they kind of pulled it out to the fields, which was surprisingly serviceable. And then there was, of course, Rotterdam, which was all close, not really all close quarters, I want to say, but more definitely urban combat. And of course, Hamada, which, believe it or not, I know a lot of people have complaints about Hamada and Conquest, but I think it plays quite fantastically in TDM and Domination, and it was no less true for Squad Conquest. Although maybe Hamada was a little bit too large, it seemed to work fairly well enough for the most part. Now, I guess one of the biggest problems that Squad Conquest has, especially given the lack of matchmaking and a lot of teams often being lopsided, was the fact that despite the maps being kind of sized like domination maps, the overall structure was Conquest, which meant you could potentially spawn trap the opposing team if you managed to wipe them off the map and push them back to their non-capturable spawn area. Non-capturable spawn area. And if this was domination, the spawns would have just simply flipped. But instead of that, we had a lot of instances where teams would get completely trapped. And despite all the interest and despite all these people trying to play the mode, too often you would see teams get pushed all the way out of the map, particularly on Rotterdam, which is very much a linear lane-based map. It was unfortunate to see, which isn't to say linear maps are bad. I think Rotterdam was arguably one of the most fun modes to play when the teams were fairly even. Well, certainly so during the scrims, I think. Although I do want to say maybe Rotterdam could have been an interesting place to experiment with having a tank on it, just because we don't often get to see tanks in urban environments. And I think if you put them on a lane map, it actually kind of reduces the problem of them not really being able to turn their turrets around, because you can kind of rely on your team to cover it. But this is kind of like higher level stuff, and if you put them in a public match mode, if anything, it would have probably exacerbated the spawn trap issue. So I can kind of understand why they didn't do it, but I think it would have been an interesting option to have for sure. Now Hamada, there's not much to say. It's a great map. I think it's one of the best infantry maps, at least that particular portion of the map that Squad Conquest used. And of course, vehicles were largely powerless. I think there are too many different angles that the tanks can get hit from, and even a light tank, I think, would struggle to deal with that particular area, especially because for instance, the light tanks do have the mobility, they lack the durability. And I've never seen a vehicle have any kind of presence on that map, and I think if anything, it would have been more interesting because Hamada is less linear and there are just so many different directions that the infantry can come from. I think kind of tanks were a wasted spot, and might as well have, I think, taken them off the map. If anything, I think I agree with a friend of mine who said the flag layouts for Squad Conquest seemed better than Domination. Because Hamada probably was the one big map that was probably as close to Domination in terms of size compared to the rest of the maps. And I think it played out all right, even with eight people. So there's that. It's a fairly good map. I thought the vehicles were completely useless on that map. And then there's, of course, Arras, which was interesting to see because I was half expecting to be playing in the close quarters area near the church, which is one of the best close quarters areas in my opinion in the game, and then they pulled it out to the fields instead, and I think that was probably the map where the vehicles were most viable, and yet even on that map, because of the way the flags were and because of the way elevation worked, vehicles generally did not have very much of an influence on the map, and also because of the foliages and all the different trenches and little bumps that infantry players could kind of traverse through, even if a tank took the B flag, for instance. It kind of felt like a missed opportunity to see, number one, to miss out on that great CQC area. And even though I think the Arras as we got it on Squad Conquest was fairly interesting enough, and it provided a bit of a variety in terms of having a more medium to long range map without necessarily becoming a ridiculously sniper favored map, as far as the synergy between the presence of the vehicles and the infantry go, it was kind of disappointing. And what I would say, actually, if anything, Squad Conquest, and by and large, kind of failed to they were quite fun to play. I think more for the infantry than the vehicles. I think the vehicles were very lacking in terms of their possible presence on all of the maps, one of which didn't even include them. And it kind of felt like a missed opportunity for sure. And I think it was even more disappointing to see kind of Squad Conquest become more like a scaled down domination, just because it kind of failed to capture what a lot of competitive players expected out of 8v8. And I'm going to kind of go on a tangent here. 8v8 in Battlefield 4 kind of took place on Conquest Small, which is kind of like a scaled down version of Conquest Large, but by no means a very small close quarters map. And even with just 16 players on the server, it was a very dense and filled out experience. Of course, it kind of requires that all of the 8 players be fairly high skilled players that can manage their own areas, be a threat to everything at all times. The vehicles be of certain caliber and a capability in terms of what they could do to have a good experience. And I think a lot of people will probably agree when I say probably until you kind of get to the higher tiers of 8v8, you can't really enjoy it that much, I think. But even then, I think 8v8 did prove that you didn't necessarily need to have 32 or 64 players to fully enjoy like a diverse combined arms experience. Both 8v8 and 10v10s both featured at least 2, sometimes even 3 different types of vehicle assets on any given map per team, and it did it fairly well, even with just maybe 4 or 5 infantry players on the map. And it was definitely true for the 10v10 scene. And sure, there was a banner or 2 on a flag or an asset to kind of accommodate for the smaller scale, but it was a fairly dense experience, a very filled out experience that really capitalized on the combined arms aspect, arcadey combined arms aspect of Battlefield series. And it was kind of sad to see them miss out on that particular opportunity, but even kind of considering how the vehicles and tanks are designed, I can also kind of see why they found it very difficult to do so. But to see them not even really implement tanks very well on an 8v8 mode was disappointing, I think. And it kind of speaks to the limitations of the tank's design in this particular game. And of course, the planes as well, though that would have been a bit of a tall order. I mean, 8v8, I think on Fael could have been interesting. Maybe not allow the Jujubes or the Junker or whatever. But it felt like a missed opportunity there. And then, of course, seeing them miss out on RSP yet again, when this would have been a fantastic time for them to try, I think was probably the most disappointing. There was actually a test cup for all platforms, including the PC, that I managed to take part in with a Frankenstein of a bunch of teams from Battlefield 1. We even saw some names from Battlefield 4, but at the end of the day, it was a fairly disastrous tournament, just because there was no RSP. There was no way for people to have a private match, so the entire tournament hinged on players being very polite to players on a public server until they could kind of fill the whole server with just the players that are supposed to be participating in a match. Which even once they achieved that, it didn't necessarily go their way, because if they had to disconnect, the matchmaking system would just kind of fill that spot up right away with a random person. And it was kind of frustrating to see things kind of shake down that way. But actually, I want to add that test cup, at least on the PC, pretty much slammed the nail in the coffin as far as retaining any interest for many of the remaining competitive players, probably spanning across the last 3 titles that actually had a competitive scene. So, no, 2, sorry. 3 if you count BF1. And it was very, very disappointing to see. So, yeah, that's all I've got to say on Squad Conquest. A lot of missed opportunities. It still did some things well, but those were things that could have been done better. The fact that we only got 3 maps as part of on a limited window nonetheless, I think it kind of speaks to the limitations of the current Tides of War model. But then, maybe it's just DICE being very cautious with the less than expected player base for the game due to various factors, I think. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you for watching. I'll have a new video up for Rush and a couple other projects. I have one big project I'll be working on that you'll be seeing soon. So if you could, I guess, subscribe, I would very much appreciate it. If not, hope you enjoyed the video. If you didn't, I guess click dislike. And thank you.